This student-made project includes themes such as physical violence, identity-based discrimination and harassment, human trafficking, and descriptions of war. Disclaimer. Centered around the rise of anti-Asian sentiment catalyzed by the COVID-19 pandemic, this documentary and those who worked on it acknowledge that just by the sheer number of different ethnic groups that make up the Asian American diaspora, it would be impossible to address each and every community and their grievances. Instead, those of us who worked on this project aim to open avenues for conversation and provide a general awareness to the issue we are highlighting. The pandemic has severely affected many avenues of life across the world. For many of us, it has reshaped our understanding of daily life, forced us to reevaluate the fragility of human existence, and tested our resolve during the most dire of situations. However, it has also shed a greater light on the prevailing injustices that have plagued society for countless years. Many Americans have only now realized the epidemic of targeted hate crimes against Asian communities within American society, but to these groups this is nothing new. For far too long, they have had to endure various forms of discrimination and assaults. To understand this issue, it is necessary to trace the history that has fostered and enabled these dangerous sentiments to flourish. Only then can we truly understand how they have been exacerbated during the pandemic and what we need to assess in order to challenge preconceptions.
Many people all over the world immigrated to the United States in hopes of starting a new and prosperous life. They came for the American dream in order to provide for their families back home in East and Southeast Asia. The first Chinese workers came during 1848 and 1855, when the gold in California was still plentiful and cheap labor was needed. Those who came after the gold rush sought work in building the first transcontinental railroad. After the completion of the railroad, the American economy began to struggle, leaving many white laborers exasperated with the growing presence of Asians in the workforce.
From 1882 to 1943, the Chinese Exclusion Act took effect across America. Although the Chinese Exclusion Act says Chinese, the act prevented immigration into America for all Asians. It also affected Chinese laborers who were already in America, preventing them from becoming citizens of the country they lived and labored in. Children of immigrants would have to prove that they were born in America to gain citizenship, but even then it wasn't guaranteed.
In 1898, the Treaty of Paris ended the war between Spain and the United States, allowing the latter to gain control of the Philippines. In 1905, Truman Hunt, a Spanish-American war veteran, made an offer to a local Igorot tribe. They were to travel with him for a year to showcase their native customs, with each of them earning $15 a month. At Coney Island, the Igorots performed exaggerated and sensationalized versions of their tribal rituals. Along with singing and dancing, they also had sham weddings and dog feasts with mutts brought from the pound. These performances exoticize and fetishize Filipino customs and traditions to entertain tourists and elite society.
In the 1940s, after Japan had bombed Pearl Harbor, President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066, forcing around 120,000 Japanese Americans and immigrants into internment camps. Similar to the Chinese Exclusion Act, Executive Order 9066 generalized numerous Asian groups into one, even though the order explicitly mentioned Japanese Americans. Many died in the camps due to poor medical care or were killed by the military guards. After World War II had ended and the internment camps were closed, it took almost 50 years for Congress to redress the events.
Yet we must recognize that the internment of Japanese Americans was just that, a mistake.
During the Vietnam War, Vietnamese refugees fled to the US and were met with hostility and racism. They were called gooks, chinks, and commies, experiencing the same sentiment Chinese Americans had encountered almost a century earlier. That sentiment of go back to where you came from and this is not your home has been a prevalent theme throughout US history towards Asian Americans, leading to the Asian American community constantly being defined as the perpetual other. During the 1982 recession, two white auto workers, Ronald Ebens and Michael Nitz, were furious after losing their jobs and blamed it on the rising presence of Japanese auto manufacturers in the United States. They took this anger out on Vincent Chin, a Chinese American man, and left him with life-threatening injuries that killed him days afterward. The two men were only sentenced to 3 years probation and received court fines. Neither of them spent a day in jail.
In 1992, when the LA riots broke out, mainstream media and news outlets focused on tensions between the Korean and African American communities. This fueled racially motivated attacks against Korean American business owners, and law enforcement refused to offer assistance for injury and property damage to them as they had for white citizens.
With the COVID-19 pandemic, it's easy to see how little has changed over the century. In 1900, an outbreak of the Bubonic Plague in San Francisco caused the city's Chinatown to go into lockdown. Nobody was allowed to go in or out, with the exception of white people. Police subjected the residents of Chinatown to forced house searches and consequently damaged their property. It was thought that the plague had started on a ship coming in from Australia, but because the first to fall ill was a Chinese immigrant, the Chinese community was blamed for the outbreak.
With the rise of the COVID-19 virus originating in Wuhan, China, the Asian American community faces yet another challenge. Asian Americans are at a higher risk for contracting the virus because they hold a disproportionately high rate of essential jobs and have the highest index of multi-generational homes. Despite this, their struggles have often been overlooked and underrepresented, leaving them with little to no support during this pandemic.
Keep calling this the Chinese virus. There are reports of dozens of incidents of bias against Chinese Americans in this country. Your own aide, Secretary Azar, says he does not use this term. He says ethnicity does not cause the virus. Why do you keep using this? A lot of people say it's racist.
It's not racist at all, no, not at all. It comes from China.
Alongside an uprising in the normalization of white supremacy and xenophobia in the United States, Donald Trump's use of racist rhetoric when referring to the coronavirus, such as China virus, Wuhan flu, or Kung flu, has also led to an exacerbation of anti-Asian sentiment in the United States. From March of 2020 to February of 2021, there have been nearly 4,000 incidents of attacks and harassment targeted towards the Asian American population. This rapid rise in targeted attacks has shown that racism is deeply ingrained in our society, and that the smallest justification is enough to resort to violence.
On March 16, 2021, Robert Aaron Long went to various massage parlors and killed a total of 8 people. 6 of those 8 were women of Asian descent. When questioned why he did it, Long claimed that he had a sex addiction and wanted to get rid of his temptations. A long history and culture of fetishization and hypersexualization of Asian women has resulted into them becoming the targets of intersectional misogyny, which, when coupled with xenophobia, encouraged Long's horrific actions.
Silence and conformity may have largely been the perceived response from within the Asian community throughout America's long history of racist abuse. However, with the younger generations of Asian Americans speaking up through social media and being proactive against discrimination and hate, along with many victims coming forward, the movement to stop the hate is starting to gain more traction. Despite the climbing number of hate crimes directed at Asian Americans, as it had always been in the course of human history, the worst situations imaginable could bring out the best in people. In tandem with the rising reports of hate and prejudice, we have also had uplifting stories of altruism with entire communities rallying together to push back against the hate. This was the case with the C family from Orange County, who were subject to harassment as soon as they moved into their new home. These incidents, composed of racist name-calling, rock throwing, and midnight disturbances, went on with increasing regularity. It seemed as though there wasn't much to be done, even with the local authorities being involved. Fortunately, their neighbors stepped in, standing guard right outside the C's home, hoping to deter would-be attackers, whose ranks were mostly children, some as young as 10.
Maddie Park, a woman from New York, had seen the increase of attacks against Asian Americans and rightly assumed that many of them were beginning to fear public transportation. In a matter of days, she managed to raise $100,000 to launch the Cafe Maddie Cab initiative, which pays for private Uber and Lyft rides for female, elderly, and LGBTQ+ Asian people.
There were also instances of financial support going towards these victims. There was the story of Xiaozhen Si, a 75-year-old Chinese grandmother who was left physically and emotionally scarred after an assailant struck her in San Francisco. A GoFundMe page created to aid her had raised close to $1 million, the entirety of which she decided to donate. According to her grandson, she insists on making this decision, saying this issue is bigger than her.
The diaspora of the Asian American community is dealing with the unique challenge of facing the COVID-19 pandemic as well as an epidemic of hate and racism. For decades, the voices and frustrations of Asian Americans have largely been ignored and silenced. If we are to provide equal opportunity, security, and liberty to all, it has to start here. There needs to be a considerable amount of introspection, conversation, and action to uplift their conditions. These steps may be difficult, but they are vital. Distant or recent, our collective histories have shown us that our struggles and achievements cannot be realized without unity and solidarity. Though these problems cannot be solved overnight, progress can be made little by little with mindfulness and openness to learning what Asian American communities went through and continue to go through.